September 14, 2005. Frances Newton was executed by lethal injection for killing her husband and two young children, Adrian age 23, Alton age 7, and baby Farrah just 21 months old, shot execution style in their Houston apartment on April 7, 1987. She maintained her innocence for 18 years, claiming a drug dealer named Charlie committed the murders. Newton became the first black woman executed in Texas since 1982, the third woman overall, and her case raised serious questions about evidence, representation, and whether the state executed an innocent woman. April 7, 1987. A Harris County apartment complex in Houston, Texas. Deputies responded to a call about a possible shooting at 6126 West Mount Houston Road. What they found inside apartment number would shock even experienced investigators. Frances Elaine Newton was an American convicted murderer who was executed by lethal injection in the state of Texas for the April 7, 1987, murders of her estranged husband, Adrian, age 23, her 7-year-old son, Alton, and her 22-month-old daughter, Farrah. All three had been shot with a .25 caliber pistol. The murders were execution style, each victim shot in close range. A husband, a young boy, and a baby not yet 2 years old, all dead in what appeared to be a targeted killing. The person who discovered the bodies was Frances Newton, the wife and mother of the victims. Frances Elaine Newton was 22 years old when her family was murdered. Newton was just shy of her 22nd birthday when she committed the murders for which she was executed. Frances and Adrian had been having marital problems. They were separated but not divorced. On April 7th, Frances claimed she had gone to Adrian's apartment to pick up their two children, Alton and Farrah, for a visit. When she arrived, she said she found the door unlocked and discovered the bodies inside. She immediately called police, but as investigators began piecing together the evidence, their attention quickly focused on Frances herself. The case against Frances Newton was built on several key pieces of circumstantial evidence. There was no eyewitness to the murders, no confession, no physical evidence directly linking her to pulling the trigger, but prosecutors believed the evidence told a clear story. The most damaging evidence against Frances was financial. Murder of her husband and children for insurance money. Newton filed claims on the life insurance policies she had taken out a month earlier. Prosecutors argued that Frances had taken out life insurance policies on Adrian and the children just weeks before the murders. After their deaths, she filed claims on those policies. The prosecution's theory: Frances Newton had murdered her entire family for $100,000 in insurance money. But Frances had an entirely different explanation for what happened that night. She maintained her innocence to the end, blaming the murders on a drug dealer named Charlie, whom her husband, whom she claimed was a drug addict, had owed money. Frances testified that Adrian had been involved with drugs and owed money to a dealer she knew only as Charlie. She claimed that Adrian's drug debts had gotten him killed, and that their children had been murdered simply because they were there. She insisted she was innocent, that she had nothing to do with the murders, and that the real killer was still out there. The prosecution dismissed this as a convenient story with no supporting evidence. There was no Charlie they could identify, no drug dealer who could be connected to the murders. To prosecutors, it was a desperate attempt by a guilty woman to create reasonable doubt. But the defense argued that the police investigation had been inadequate, that authorities had focused solely on Frances and failed to properly investigate other potential suspects. The physical evidence in the case was problematic from multiple angles. The murder weapon was a .25 caliber pistol that prosecutors claimed belonged to Frances. Ballistics testing confirmed this gun had fired the shots that killed Adrian, Alton, and Farrah. The gun had been found in Frances's possession, though the defense argued this proved nothing about who had actually used it the night of the murders. More controversially, gunshot residue testing was performed on Frances. The tests came back positive, indicating she had recently been in contact with a firearm. But gunshot residue can transfer easily and remain on skin and clothing for hours or even days. The defense argued this didn't prove Frances had fired the murder weapon, only that she had been near a gun at some point. The prosecution also pointed to Frances's behavior after the murders. She appeared calm, collected, almost unemotional according to some witnesses. To prosecutors, this suggested guilt. To the defense, it suggested shock and trauma. Everyone processes grief differently. Newton was convicted on November 7, 1988, just over a year and a half after the murders. The jury deliberated and found Frances Newton guilty of capital murder. During the sentencing phase, they were asked to determine whether she should receive life in prison or the death penalty. The jury chose death. Frances Newton, at just 23 years old, became one of the youngest women ever sent to Texas death row. She would spend the next 17 years fighting for her life, maintaining her innocence, and challenging the evidence that had convicted her. Over the next nearly 2 decades, Frances Newton's case would become increasingly controversial. Questions emerged about the quality of her legal representation, the reliability of the forensic evidence, and whether racial bias had played a role in her conviction and death sentence. Frances was represented by a court-appointed attorney during her trial. Later appeals and advocacy groups argued that her defense had been inadequate, that crucial evidence had not been properly investigated, and that alternative suspects had not been pursued. Forensic experts began questioning the gunshot residue evidence. They argued that the testing methods used in 1987 were less reliable than modern standards, and that the positive result could have multiple innocent explanations. Most troubling were questions about the gun itself. The .25 caliber pistol that prosecutors claimed was the murder weapon had been tested, but some experts later questioned whether the ballistics evidence definitively proved this specific gun had fired the fatal shots. By 2005, Frances Newton had exhausted most of her appeals. Multiple courts had reviewed her case and upheld her conviction. But as her execution date approached, advocacy groups, civil rights organizations, and anti-death penalty activists intensified their efforts to stop it. Frances Newton was executed Wednesday for the fatal shootings of her husband and 2 children 18 years ago, becoming the 3rd woman and first Black woman to be put to death in the state since executions resumed in 1982. Frances Newton's execution would make history, but not in a way anyone wanted. She would become the first Black woman executed in Texas since the resumption of capital punishment in 1982. The racial implications of Frances's case had been part of the controversy from the beginning. Civil rights advocates pointed out that Black defendants, particularly Black women, faced disproportionate death sentences compared to white defendants convicted of similar crimes. They argued that if Frances had been white, or if her victims had been white strangers rather than her Black family members, she might not have received the death penalty at all. The statistics supported this concern. Defendants who kill family members, especially in cases without eyewitnesses, often receive life sentences rather than death. But prosecutors maintained that the evidence justified the death sentence regardless of race. They pointed to the insurance policies, the gun, the gunshot residue, and Frances's opportunity to commit the crime. As September 14, 2005 approached, Frances's legal team made final desperate appeals to stop the execution. They filed last-minute motions asking for DNA testing of evidence that hadn't been tested during the original trial. DNA technology had advanced significantly since 1987. Evidence that couldn't have been properly analyzed at the time of the murders could now potentially exclude Frances as the killer or identify the real murderer. But the courts rejected the DNA testing request, ruling it came too late in the appeals process. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles reviewed clemency petitions asking them to recommend that Governor Rick Perry commute Frances's sentence to life in prison. The board voted unanimously to deny clemency. Governor Perry, who had the power to grant a 30-day stay of execution, chose not to intervene. Frances Newton would be executed as scheduled. On September 14, 2005, Frances Newton spent her final hours on death row. Like all condemned inmates, she was allowed visitors, could meet with spiritual advisors, and was offered a final meal. Frances's parents visited her, as did her surviving family members. The children she had been convicted of murdering, Alton and Farrah, had been dead for 18 years. Frances had spent nearly 2 decades in prison maintaining that she didn't kill them. As 6 p.m. approached, Frances was prepared for execution and escorted to the death chamber at the Huntsville unit. Frances Newton was strapped to the gurney in the execution chamber. In one witness room sat representatives of her family, her legal team, and supporters who believed she was innocent. In another witness room sat representatives of Adrian Newton's family and others who believed justice was being served. According to witnesses, Frances Newton made a brief final statement. She maintained her innocence to the end, telling those present that she had not killed her husband and children. She expressed love for her family and asked God for forgiveness, not for murder, which she denied, but for whatever sins she had committed in life. At approximately 6:12 p.m., the lethal injection began flowing through the foreline. The single drug used, pentobarbital, quickly took effect. Frances Newton was pronounced dead at 6:20 p.m. on September 14, 2005. She was 40 years old. Frances Newton was executed Wednesday for the fatal shootings of her husband and 2 children 18 years ago, becoming the 3rd woman and 1st black woman to be put to death in the state since executions resumed in 1982. The execution sparked immediate controversy. Opponents of the death penalty held vigils outside the prison. Civil rights organizations issued statements condemning what they called a racially biased execution based on questionable evidence. Anti-death penalty advocates pointed to Frances's case as an example of why capital punishment should be abolished. But supporters of the death penalty argued that justice had been served. A woman who murdered her husband and 2 innocent children, including a baby, had faced the consequences of her crimes. The evidence, they maintained, clearly supported her guilt. In the years since Frances Newton's execution, questions about her case have not disappeared. In fact, they have intensified as more information has emerged about problems with forensic evidence and inadequate legal representation in death penalty cases.